record to cloud because I've got. Okay, so just so people know up front that it's being recorded, was telling me yesterday that I had too much in the cloud. So where we got to last week, and just for those of you who might be dropping in for the first time this week, the whole 3 sessions are around AOD with a particular focus on methamphetamine. There's no right and wrong in this. It's about investigating, going on a journey together. I read through I really want to thank those people who took the time to answer the questions and put them back, because that gives us feedback to how you heard what we said. One of the themes that came out for me is that we can teach you as much as we know about this topic. And probably a mistake that, Josie, Jackson, myself, Malcolm, Cass, what we've made as a sector along the way is our complete lack of understanding on key messaging when we're working with the media. We tend to work to data. We tend to use what's logical for us to try and sell a story, but that clearly doesn't have cut through. So one of the, I suppose, an area I spent a little bit of time in a few years back was actually learning a little bit more about key messaging. So at the end of today, we're actually going to flip into a little bit of work on key messaging about what you've heard today. So yes, you may have the facts, we may have all of that data, we can say that this is what the picture is, but how do we get that message across when we're speaking at family barbecues, at work functions, and if we're speaking in the media, because getting Joe Public on side is really important. And we've seen that more than ever at the moment with what's happening with COVID, that it doesn't matter about vaccination, all of that, what we say, it's how people interpret it. And if you didn't get a chance to watch the drum on Monday night, I really strongly suggest you get on iView and catch that one up, because they had one of the best key messages in the game on, talking about how we do get our information across, and you'll learn a lot as you go through listening to people like that. So I'm just checking if there's anyone left. So as I'm doing this, I'm letting people in, and I'm not a great multitasker by any stage. So I'm going to start by welcoming back Josie and Jackson, and acknowledging that I have Malcolm and Cass, who both sit on my exec, who were really instrumental in getting this ball up and rolling. Josie and Jackson, how's your week been?
After you, Josie.
That's going to get back at you, Jackson. Don't you worry about that.
I know.
It's been confusing, to be honest, to try and work the operations in with the restrictions that are in place. So, and I think Jackson and I have both come down with half colds, I think, through this week. So it's been a little bit challenging, but that's me. So, Jackson, how are you?
Nothing to add, Josie. Exactly the same.
Yeah.
It's always interesting, these snap like lockdowns from a service delivery perspective. There's a lot that needs to kind of happen really, really quickly, and
Has he frozen on us?
Jackson, see, that's what happens when you don't go first, Jackson. I suspect we're going to get a little bit of this today, so it's another resilience builder. Jackson, you just glitched out.
I'm back. The really humorous thing there is I was talking about the challenges of engaging with people online, and my internet dropped out. Yes. But, it should be as easy as, you just deliver your counselling and your case management or whatever it is online. But a lot of the people that we work with don't have means and access. So it's not as simple as that. It's always a bit of fun, and it certainly keeps us on our toes, Lee.
Yeah, for sure. And look, I'm going to ask the students too, just before we begin, it's something we've always done in our sessions, is out of 10, how do we think everyone's travelling this week? Want to show us how we think we're travelling? Yeah. Again, have a bit of a reflection. If you're sitting at 5 or less, that's a really good opportunity to reach out and have a chat to someone around you. So if you're getting through this session, if you're online today, you've taken a first step, you're actually out there doing something. But, if you're finding by the end of this, you really want to check out, touch base with someone and have a chat, because we're all doing that at the moment. We're all touching base with people. That's really important. My partner's been talking about survivor guilt at the moment, that because we're up here and we're not in Victoria, the guilt we have for not being in lockdown with our family and loved ones. And it's, we can do what we want. Well, unless Typhoid Mary's got more ideas for us, but the Sunshine Coast's a long way away from us. But yeah, so it is impacting on everyone in very different ways. Now, down to some work. We asked the students, and a few of the students had a crack at getting back to us a few questions, and I'm actually going to ask those questions of you and Jackson and Josie now. And after you, Josie, I'll get Jackson to go first on this one. I want to ask you, we talked a lot about AOD. We talked about what the media proposed to us was a crisis last week. What I'm wondering from your perspective is, how do we determine if there's a crisis, Jackson? What does it look like? What do we use to evidence that?
It's really about impact, I think, is number one. What's, if we're looking at this whole notion of an ice epidemic, well, the first question you need to ask is, what is the impact? What are the indicators that this hypothesis is occurring? And then it comes down to mining data from all various different sources. So, a lot of the references, particularly in the articles that are presented as part of this, are looking at the impacts on crime, on the justice system, and things like that. So it's a really hard thing to define an epidemic. And I think the term itself is used quite flippantly and quite frequently. And as a result of that, it's quite easy to say that anything negative can become an epidemic. But in the context of ice, and when we look at that at a local level, so Geelong, for example, it's really a position of opinion in many ways. And it's really up to you as an individual and what you think and how you define an epidemic in the context of, the discussion points that we look at. So I think, for me personally, and how we as a service would start to understand the significance of a problem, is we would look at the various key data sets. So how many people are using a substance? Has that increased in terms of the amount of people using the substance? Has it increased with new people? And what I mean by that is it people transferring from one substance to another substance, or is it newbies, so to speak, that haven't touched drugs before and are now using ice? And then it's about looking at the impacts. So, as a result of an increased drug use, are we seeing crime rates increase? Are we seeing homelessness increase? Are we seeing family violence increase? And if so, is that related to the increase in ice use? Or is it just an anomaly that sits aside that? So it's quite a hard process to go through analysing all of that data from various sources. And for anyone that's ever mined data or analysed data, it never sits nicely in a box. So I think it's a really challenging space, Lee, and it's a really hard one when you're constantly bombarded with this messaging of there's an epidemic, there's a crisis. If I would certainly see COVID as an epidemic and a national crisis. Would I use the same terminology in terms of ice use in the community? Personally, probably not.
Josie, I want to pick out a point. Jackson talked about a whole range of areas there, and I know a lot of those areas don't sit neatly in your funding stream or in your area of expertise. I know that I'm one of those unique people who does go across all the silos. When you go to mine data, like what Jackson said, and it is really messy, where and how do you find the spaces to link up with hospitals, with police, with all of these different areas? And schools start to tell us one story over here. So we already know we've got departments of education, health and housing. Where do you sit? When do you get the opportunity to sit with those groups and look at comparing and mining that data?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Lee. And I think, I guess I always operate with partnerships and having relationships with your key stakeholders. So all of those different service areas that Jackson mentioned, if we're looking at data and mining it and looking at what's purposeful and what's meaningful, we can then be assertive about reaching out to the key stakeholders like the Department of Education or Child Protection and try and look at better service system responses. So we do have a number of meetings that we come together with different service parts of the service sector to look at more refined service system coordination would be what I would term it as. And we don't always get it right, but that data can guide us as to our program improvement opportunities. I guess when I was listening to Jackson, I was kind of going, we draw on our experience, and everybody who has an opinion around the epidemic is drawing on their own vested interests, if you know what I mean. So we have to be quite respectful of that. And what comes to mind is, you know, we might not be having the same experience as the emergency department with people who are using ice. So we have to respect that there might not be people that are getting to treatment, but they're definitely having an impact at that emergency setting. So, you know, our connection with Barwon Health is super, super important to try and get those people to the right place. So when we think about data, we're interested in various sources of data. Ambulance attendances, I think that was one of the sources of data that was used in the ICE articles. That's a real experience from their perspective. So we need to draw on it and try and come up with a shared perspective on that. And that's the challenge, because we're not all having the same experience with the ICE epidemic. So yeah, the networking and partnerships are key. And we always come from a relationship building approach. It's easier to build a relationship with somebody and then have the hard discussions if you need to, than just ring someone cold and go, hey, why do you think this? Or what are you thinking there? So yeah, relationship-based approaches are key at all levels of the work we do.
Yeah.
Is that your question? Yeah.
Yeah, just before we move on, Cass has put some definitions in the chat about the difference between a pandemic and endemic, and we will send those through to government, because from time to time I've heard government mix those up a little bit in the last few months.
Absolutely.
It's good to have a page open if you can do it, if you're not on a phone or a small device, and do some cut and paste out of the chat if people put information in there. So just getting that cut and paste. You'll also notice right up the top, I've put the link to the survey, which helps us evaluate how you found these sessions. So if you get a chance to cut and paste that out too, that would be fantastic before you log off today.
Lee, the only thing, if you've logged on late, I don't think you get the older chat. So right. I can't see the link that you've posted because I was on later. Okay. So it might be worth posting again.
All right, because I'm very good at multitasking. What I'll do is all right, I'll do that. One of the things, Josie, I want to just follow up from what you were saying. Sorry, I'm trying to keep my track of thought, but I'm doing other stuff. Is where does anecdotal evidence sit in all of this?
So that's a good question too, Lee. Challenging, but I think it's like, I guess that's part of that experience stuff that we talk about. So when we talk about, it probably makes me think about evidence-based practice, if you know what I mean. So we can get stuck on, oh my God, we have to have an evidence base around something before we implement it. But in the work we do, practice experience and kind of learning as you go and being open to innovation is super, super important too. So when I think about, and I can't even say that word properly, anecdotal evidence, but that it is that kind of drawing in what you know from levels of intuition, levels of kind of, but drawing from conversations that you have from subject experts that are there and having that experience, because all that stuff's really, really important. You can't just go on the numbers, you've got to go on the qualitative data as well and people's experience and draw it all together. So I do feel like, yeah, often that gets overlooked because it hasn't got a backing to it, but it's really important to consider that as part of the whole picture. Does that respond to, yeah?
Yeah, for sure. Jackson, I'm going to ask you to sort of expand a little bit on that. And can I let everyone know that these guys have not had these questions up front?
No.
So I really respect the fact, because anyone who knows me knows it's very rare do I have a plan. So just sometimes we're going to need time to stop and have a break and have a think, and that's completely okay. That's how we work. Jackson, we talk about practice-based evidence and evidence-based practice, and anyone who knows me knows I've been fighting for practice-based evidence to have a seat at the table. If we're only working from evidence-based practice or evidence-based data, how timely is that with where we're at that time? How what's the time lag that if we're working with a system that's developed in a university that's got to be rolled out, or working with data sets that are collected in a certain way, how can that impact on our business?
Good question. One of the challenges with data-informed practice development, let's call it, is that data that's collected, and we'll use the AOD space for example, is always behind where you're at that day. So there's always a delay between the data being collected, being reviewed, being analysed, and then useful information coming out of that. There's always a delay period. And that delay might only be a day or two if it's internal. We do mine a lot of our own data internally. But if we're looking at getting data sets from the Department of Health or a government branch, there tends to be a greater delay by the time we receive that data. So, let's say we use, statistics around ice use in the Surf Coast, right? So we're looking at data there. We want to get a picture of, is there an increase in ice use in the Surf Coast, right? And we might be seeing trends that's increasing, but chances are we're kind of 2-3 months behind in the data that we're receiving. So what that means is you then have to anecdotally or experientially predict where that trend is now going. So if we looked at data over the course of a 12-month period, right? So let's say we're looking at that today, we're in June, we're probably looking at data from May, April backwards. We're using that data to predict the likelihood of where that trend's going over that missing couple of months. So there will always be a delay, but that's where that anecdotal kind of experiential piece is really important. And the longer you're in that space, the more you can kind of predict, within reason, what the likelihood is in that missing piece.
Yeah. Josie, you got anything?
As you were talking, the only thing that sits with me that hasn't probably been mentioned is that consumer voice in that, and really honing in on consumer voice and what their experience is of the current situation and access to services and all that sort of jazz. So, and that's hard to do in a really solid way at times, because you want to pay people for their time as a consumer when they're actually offering their expertise, because they are subject experts. And we don't get a lot of funding in the setting in drug and alcohol to actually put out a very solid, robust framework for consumers to lean into to get paid for their time. Mental health do it really, really well. So I'm hoping that through the kind of mental health reform space and drug and alcohol reform, they're now being seen together a lot more. I'm hoping we can learn from our mental health people to bring in some of those models into our drug and alcohol setting more and more, because it's got to be funded properly to do it properly, or else it becomes tokenistic with consumers. So we're always about, if someone's going to give us feedback, it's really important to provide feedback back to them to actually know that they've been listened to and validated in the whole mix of things. But yeah, just flagging that is something Jackson and I are really clear on. It's a need, but how do we do it properly and effectively, and use that intel to kind of bring the whole data set together, because the consumers are the most important piece in it, in my mind. So yeah, just to flag that.
No, it leads me into my next question, because as I was writing things, I was thinking, how are they going to answer it? This week's paper, new facility being announced for Geelong, mental health, $16 million. Bringing together the conversations we've had of, we're working with data sets from when, what's using this, we know election cycles, we know reform, there's a whole range of things. What do you think was the tipping point to get this announcement for this $16 million facility?
Advocacy is a big one. Advocacy.
Yeah.
So, when there's enough voices crying out for the need for something, then, usually there will be some, response in the positive from the state government. I think that played a big part in this. but it's evidence. So it's combining the two things we're talking about, being experiential data and the narrative behind why something is important and why it's needed, and then solidifying that with the kind of quantitative data, saying there's, you know, a number to the need, and that number's on the rise. Therefore, we need to have a response to that.
Yeah. Josie, we were talking about, you were starting to talk about co-design and the importance of consumer voice. When I look at a mental health AOD opportunity, then that creates a really good opportunity for us to do some co-design in the AOD space that we haven't been able to do before, because they're already doing it in mental health. Can you see that as a really good opportunity in this?
I see that as an amazing opportunity, and to put in a plug for Primary Health Network, they're actually the Westvic Primary Health Network. They've already started co-design processes in the background around the new centres that are being proposed. So there has been service users' voices in it. There has been service providers' voices in it. So I feel like there's been a real focus on that voice being heard in what's been announced, because we do know that comorbidity or dual diagnosis, whatever term you want to kind of throw in there, is real, and we can't separate the two. And a person who's experiencing all of those things needs a response to all of them, not just one, and then the door close and off you go to the next service to deal with your housing. So more and more that service system design is lending itself to what does the person need that's walking in the front door, and how does the tapestry of services behind it actually meet those needs. But that then demands work from Jackson and I to work out all of our funding streams and how they fit together, and how we can remove the barriers that might sit within those funding streams for access, because often it gets really clunky when you bring new programs in and they're using different tools and systems, and it's like, well, how do we fit into that? So there you go, back to that importance of networking and partnerships and having the forums set up already that can actually work through that before a centre lands. My biggest fear with the new centre is that work won't be done, and then we have another service in the area that's feeling duplicative, for want of a better word. Because we're always, and I talk from my kind of philosophy, but I always like to think that we can bring the puzzle together from lots of different agencies that play the best role within that area to make the whole picture work and the most effective picture on the ground. So yeah, that's kind of my response to that one. Yeah.
Jackson, you got anything to add to that, or?
No, I don't think so.
All right. I suppose a couple of the people mentioned in their responses that the Portugal models, the Czech models of where they've decriminalised and that real stigma stuff that's been looked at. Your sense of how close we are to something like that in Australia at the moment? What's your sense?
I love this topic.
Yeah, I know.
I noticed Josie didn't even bother unmuting her microphone. I find this such a fascinating area to discuss. And it's a similar area of discussion as legalising cannabis, for example, for medicinal purposes. I think one of the challenges with it is, again, the media is really good at promoting an agenda around these things. So when we look at, we use Portugal for an example, where they decriminalise drug use, right, is kind of the broad sweeping statement. It's not as necessarily, it's not as it sounds. So we do quite a bit of that already in particularly Victoria, where we look at, what they're saying is it's not legal to take drugs, but it's about looking at it from a health response rather than a justice response. And we see already there's courts in place, particularly the drug courts around the state, that have those responses. So for low-level possession charges of cannabis, for example, where historically a person would get a charge and conviction, they might now be offered what's called an other diversion, where rather than a conviction, they're funneled into what is essentially mandated drug treatment. Right? So where there's elements of that decriminalisation piece that are already in play within our system. However, is it on the scale to somewhere like Portugal? No, it's not. And is that necessarily the best way to go? I think there's still a lot of research that needs to be done in terms of long term. These shifts in other countries haven't been around for long periods of time yet. Whilst a lot of the data at this point is quite suggestive that it's having a positive outcome, there's still a long way to go before we get a true representation over a lifespan piece, for example, so a 70, 80 year window. So I think it's not as simple as looking at what works in another country and going, let's replicate that here, because there's the cultural differences in every community, in every state, in every country, in every corner of the world. So it's a very big kind of consideration to go down that road, but it needs to be localized in the context of a culture of a country and a group of people. Is my very quick rant on that, Lee.
No, that's a well-rehearsed quick rant. Thank you, Jackson. Josie, can I just ask you to clarify a couple of points? I know we talk about things and I just want to make sure some of the terminology. What exactly does drug court do? How does it work?
Drug court. So, and jump in, Jackson, because you might have a better sense of the drug courts, because I haven't been in areas where they've been functioning, to be honest, a specific drug court. I do see the health response stuff as being paramount in the philosophical kind of drug court space. So it's someone does go, and jump in, Jackson, but someone does still go to the courts and actually stand in front of the judge, but the response is different. It's actually looking at more of probably the social determinants of health and where that person is sitting, and actually really giving them an opportunity in a formal way with an order around it, or a bit of kind of, this is what you have to do, to engage with those services and then come back to the drug courts in a few months and actually work through where they're at that point. It's an opportunity to change before they get kind of stuck within that criminal system. Because in the criminal courts, straight away, you're probably going to get some sort of conviction. You still might get offered an order, but it's not often that you have to go back to the judge to actually have that kind of progress update heard. It's more just in your corrections sort of space and in your order space. So it becomes more of a kind of impetus to change, for want of a better word, because you do have to front back up to the courts and talk about where you're at. But that's my understanding of it. Have I got that right, Jackson, in the sense of how they operate? Yeah.
Yep. One of the biggest differences is you've got magistrates that are more educated in the space of drug and alcohol treatment. So it very much is shifting from a criminalisation response to a health response without disbanding the need for justice, so to speak. So the main difference is that you'll have judges that are more equipped to understanding what treatment is available, but it also tends to be a more conversational kind of experience for the person, whereas rather than, here's the evidence, here's your sentence, see you later, it is the first step on a person going to drug court is very much more around, what's led you to this. So the magistrate wants to understand the factors around, whatever crime has been alleged, and the relationship to that and drug use. And then there's an accountability process put in place, as Josie said. So, you will agree to, attend 15 counselling sessions. And then once that's completed on this date, you come back and we'll discuss where to from here. So there's a bit more leniency in the term of treatment, mandated treatment being the punishment, if you will, rather than just going to jail. But there's also that accountability piece. And the other biggest difference is it is a quicker process. So there's an understanding within the drug court that response to drug-related issues needs to be, quite prompt and quite as immediate as possible. So for a person who finds themselves in that position, they're going to get into the drug court in front of a magistrate quicker than they would through traditional, magistrate court processes.
Yeah.
So one of the questions we've got coming up is, what is the long-term support? Is it just for the term of that, or and talk about that pathway into treatment support? So they're the sort of questions we're starting to get on the chat. That continued support outreach type model, and some concern about the longevity of recovery if there was no follow-up. And we know at the moment it's something that tends to be more in metro. We haven't had a lot of drug court in regional Vic at the moment. Is that what are the plans, I suppose, at the back end of an exit strategy out of something like that?
We've always had people referred to us through the courts for drug and alcohol treatment. The drug court just allows for a bit more of a health response. When we talk about, so I guess we talk about mandated clients, people who have to come and see us. We're always working with that person to try and maintain the support and treatment that can be offered beyond the period of the mandated time. So that's up to the individual. Like if they basically end that mandated time, they've had a good experience of actually coming in to see a service and they want to continue, we're not going to shut the doors. It's actually just about popping them into another treatment stream so they can be seen as a voluntary client and they're actually continuing to work through their goals for recovery and support. So it doesn't mean an instant door shut, that's it. It's very much up to the individual at that point. And that's why, I really like when I was doing the clinical work or the counselling work, I would love that moment where you would see somebody go, oh yeah, I'm getting something from this. It's not just because I've been told to by the courts, and really kind of commit to the rest of the journey. But I see it as a real opportunity when you've got somebody in that space to, offer them a positive experience, because people do think we're just going to kind of go, stop taking drugs. We don't come from that perspective. It's much more about harm reduction, how you're going to keep yourself safe, how you're going to start to function again if it's really impacted on your functioning. So that probably responds to that question, I think. Yeah. Seeing a thumbs up from Tracy. Yeah.
Jackson, the other thing we talked about then was diversions. What are the sorts of diversions that are on offer? And there's always that really fine line with paternalistic modelling when we're talking about this sort of stuff. And we live in this world, and Malcolm, you might like to jump in at some stage too, where we know we have a Mental Health Act, and the Mental Health Act works in a certain way. We know through the drug courts we're doing roughly something the same. The models can't be the same, but what can we learn from each model? But what are the sort of diversions that can be on offer?
Yeah, there's a myriad of them. So the standard ones are, and we talk about a mandated client, or I'll probably say forensic, which means the same thing. So, I find myself in front of a magistrate and, for whatever reason I'm there and it's related to drug use, right? There's kind of your more common ones are a community corrections order, which I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, have heard of before. And that's where there is an order put in place for a person who's in the community who needs to adhere to X, Y, and Z to complete their order. And they go for a specified period of time. And then if they complete those, they come back to the magistrate, and that's time served, all good, carry on. And that could include an aspect of drug and alcohol treatment, which could be any form of treatment that's on offer. So it could be that they need to engage in counselling, they need to engage in care coordination, they need to engage in residential rehab, they need to engage in non-residential rehab, whatever it may be. But there's a very specific plan put in place for that individual, and they need to adhere to that. The other one, which I touched on just before, is an other diversion. So they're often or most commonly given out by the police. So that's where a police member might come across someone in the street, and they've got a low quantity of usually cannabis on them. Rather than send them through the court systems, they get placed on another diversion where, again, they need to go and they need to engage in counselling, let's say. And if they fail to do that and meet those requirements, then they find themselves in the court system and will probably end up on a community corrections order. The other one that we see a lot is around, you kind of lump them together as bail conditions or pre-prison and post-prison, where a person is currently incarcerated and then as part of their reintegration program back into the community, they'll be required to engage in AOD treatment. So for the most part, a CCO or a community corrections order is the most common. And then from there, you're drilling down into very specific types of orders, such as family reunification orders, which are specific to the children's court, where there is a minor and custody involved. And again, an element of those orders will specify, if appropriate, that AOD treatment is required, and that needs to be completed as part of that overall order. And in this case, the goal is to reunify a child and their parent more often than not. And then there's, they trickle down into a whole bunch of other different ones that come under those umbrellas.
Yep. Malcolm, have you got anything you want to add to that?
Definitely. I think where I wanted to have this conversation is there are quite a few people advocating across the sector for involuntary treatment similar to the Mental Health Act, and people don't understand the difference. Treatment in terms of mental health, roughly half of those people admitted to an inpatient unit in mental health in Victoria are involuntary patients. That means they need to not just comply with engagement in the service if they're in the community. They're in an inpatient setting, then unable to leave unless they have leave rights granted, but they also have to take medication. So it's enforced. It's not we'll give you an injection or treatment if you like it. We have a mental health tribunal. That means that any of us can be detained under the Mental Health Act for a period of 72 hours, after which we must be reviewed and we must have legal support to go through that process. So under the Mental Health Act, it's very different to saying you must attend a counselling session. Under the Mental Health Act, you must engage with a community case manager, with the treating psychiatrist in the inpatient unit, but you also need to comply with your medication. And if you refuse your medication, it can be administered against your will.
Yep.
So very different processes, but often we get our terminology and it's the nuances under the Act. And, I think particularly the media responds to violent presentations in the ED as a reason to enact involuntary treatment, yet we know in mental health, involuntary treatment hasn't reduced the number of crisis admissions. If anything, it means that people are left in the community untreated until they reach crisis, so that we feel sometimes as mental health practitioners that the best way to engage in the treatment is under involuntary care, when we actually know the evidence is counterintuitive for that. But the thing, and finally, the thing that I was really interested in is in America, they did a survey of drug and alcohol counsellors recently, where over 70% stated they would like to see mandated involuntary treatment as, for residential rehab and other settings to manage high-risk clients. And that concerns.
What are your thoughts on that, Jackson? I actually saw that too.
It's a shocking idea. And this is, I'm just sharing my very personal view. It's not representative of anything else. But I think there's a massive difference between mental ill health and drug use. And to classify the two under the same banner of what treatment will and won't work is a dangerous road to take. I think the biggest issue that I have with true mandated AOD treatment, which is essentially a prison type arrangement where you're confined and controlled for a period of time, is that all of the current evidence suggests that, you know, one of the most effective ways to treat addiction is through connection. So there's strong relationships between people being disconnected from themselves, from the community, from their family, from friendship circles, just completely isolated, that can perpetuate really significant and traumatic drug use. So the answer to that then would be the opposite, right? And it's about connection and enabling people to connect with themselves, to connect with society, to connect with like-minded people, and reintegrate back into what they want in what they deem as a functional life. So to completely isolate someone and lock them up really contradicts that, but it is also not addressing the social issues of drug use. And, you know, any researcher or kind of educator in this field will tell you that the best response to drug and alcohol in the community is prevention, education, and early intervention. All right. But that can still happen whilst the person is in a place of addiction. You know, we can still educate, we can still reduce harm, and we can get to a point where we're preventing that. And I think that response still needs to remain the same. And there was a question earlier around that kind of mandated, what happens after they complete their mandated piece. That's when it becomes a choice. And that, for me, is the most fundamental part of treating addiction, is that it is a choice. You can force someone to not use drugs for a period of time, but unless their thoughts change, their processes internally change, chances are they'll use drugs again. So we need to respond to the core root of what perpetuates drug use. And that is this internal process. CBT, for those of you that have heard of that, cognitive behavioral therapy, has evidence to be a really good response to helping someone work through addiction, which is addressing the thoughts behind it and the feelings and the processes. Right. So I think rather than disempowering a person by confining them, locking them up and controlling them, my view is the approach sits at the other end of the spectrum, which is empowering a person to make the choices that they need to make to get to where they want to go. The challenge is they have to be at that point where they're ready for that. And I think, you know, what we're reading in the news, and often the view of the community, is that, well, it needs to happen on our terms. It needs to happen now, and it needs to be fixed immediately. The thing that makes addiction so challenging is it's all about the person, and it's all about them getting to the point where they're ready, where they're willing, where they're able. And it's our job, you know, Josie and me and our teams, to facilitate that journey for a person to get to that point where they go, oh, I'm ready now. I'm feeling like I'm ready and able to make change. And it needs to happen on their terms, not ours.
And we know that, you know, addiction is not something that's convenient for anyone, and it's certainly not convenient for the person who's dealing with the addiction either. Josie, what happens when there's people in the immediate surrounds of that person, their whānau or their community around them, when they're ready to engage around somebody that they love or care for, but the person themselves is not ready? You know, what sort of service response do we have for that? And I'm an adolescent specialist, so for me, that's something that's really, really important. But I think it is the whole way through too.
Yeah, and look, we're getting better at supporting family and significant others and natural support systems, because I guess just to take, because we have child, youth and family funded services to work with family members who might be the ones, because when we talk about impact, often the person that's using, to use the word happy user, we work from the stages of change kind of approach, which fits with, so most of you would be familiar with that, I think, through your studies. But if someone's pre-contemplative, they're in that happy user space, so they're not ready to shift and move. So at that point, you'd be offering that person more of that, how are you going to do this safer? But the family might be going, oh my God, this is really unsafe. We need to get support for ourselves. So we can offer interventions that work with the family to try and support them to actually be empowered to set boundaries around that substance use and the harm that it could possibly create to the family and the individual. And we work with the family to try and get to the point where they can work with their person, or the community can work with that person to try and do the work that Jackson just described, that a service might, to get someone motivated for change. But at the end of the day, we haven't had a lot of funded services to do that family drug and alcohol support, but it is much more prominent in our work now. And I think even individual counselling sort of places and programs now would look at that family inclusive approach. What becomes difficult is consent sometimes, but if there's enough risk in a situation, we're going to break that consent because it's about keeping somebody safe. And I think, Malcolm, when you spoke a little bit about the legal frameworks, I remember years ago, we've never enacted it with anyone we work with, but there was a legal thing come in where you could actually mandate somebody, if they were seen to be unwell enough, into detox in a hospital setting. And I think that's still around, but it was a really difficult one to enact because you had to have 3 or 4 professional opinions to try and drag.
I was talking to the expert in the next room, and they said that it sits there, but it's almost impossible to enact. As someone who works in the mental health space, they said it's very, very difficult. Jack, Josie, Malcolm, I'm going to throw you a scenario now because I've been watching Malcolm and Jackson play tennis below me in the chat for the last 2 minutes while I've been trying to listen. A family come to you, because you make my job easier, a family come to you about their 16, 17-year-old who's not involved in any sort of police matter as such. They don't have anything on that crime radar, but their methamphetamine use is super, super high, super dangerous. They've had numerous, ED admissions, and the young person has basically said they have no interest in stopping what they're doing, and they are absolutely at risk of ODing. Their polyuse is getting bigger. It's escalating. What are your options with that person when we're getting to that extreme point?
Good question.
Jackson?
I think there's 2 massive considerations here. One is the family unit and one is the individual. And those things need to be addressed individually but simultaneously. And I think that, if we look at, and it very much depends on the philosophy of addiction and treatment that you as a service hold. And I know for us, it's very much about harm reduction and harm minimisation. And it's interesting that survey that Malcolm referenced in the States, where they're painting it with a broad brush, their approach is still very much abstinence and 12-step based in the United States, which is reflective in that 70% response rate. So my position on that would be to work with the family to reduce and minimise harm as much as possible for that young person. So what can they do? And it's the practical elements around, make sure you don't leave the young person alone for too long. Make sure that, if they are injecting, make sure that they've got access to clean injecting equipment. So it's all those practicable pieces. And then it's with that young person, it's about supporting them through this time. At some point, we have to believe and we have to hope that they're going to want to change, right? And it's about making sure that they know where to go when that time comes, and that hopefully they're around to be able to make that choice and make that decision at some point. And that's done through harm reduction. So educating them. And I say it to people that I've come across in my work all the time. I'm not here to tell you whether you should or shouldn't use drugs, mate. That's up to you. But if you're going to do it, can I help you do it a bit more safely? Yeah. So it's providing that safe space in the sense that the young person knows that at some point when they're ready, they can seek help and they can start that change process, and minimising the harm along the way would be my approach.
Yeah, great response. Josie, have you got anything you want to add to that?
No, I think Jackson articulated that absolutely beautifully. The only thing that comes to mind is naloxone. We now have access to naloxone, and we're very encouraging of family members having that on them in case their young person happens to overdose and they're around. So that's something that's been amazing for the sector, to have more open access to naloxone and be able to kind of provide that to carers that are concerned about their young person. So just wanted to flag that one in there because it's a really good thing. And I think we're seeing a lot more freedom and flexibility for people to have access to that through changes to legislation around that.
And great talk about people who are substance users actually having access to that for their own peer groups as well.
Yes, absolutely. There's been some really good outcomes from that. And we've got a very active harm reduction team in Craig Harvey and his crew that work along Barwon Health, at Barwon Health, who promote that and are prepared to come out and work with us as service providers to get us really, have the capacity and confidence to use that within our spaces as well. But sorry, Jackson, you were going to jump in there. I jumped in before you.
No, we're just about to reschedule it, which is good. So it's going to move to a scheduled drug that doesn't require a prescription from a GP, which is a really exciting development.
Yeah, they've been pushing for that for a while, so that's taken quite some time.
It has.
Yeah.
As long as it's not on Medicare, it should be safe. Malcolm.
Is Malcolm there? Yeah.
Malcolm, have you got anything you want to add to that?
Look, I think the thing that concerns me when we talk about substance use still, particularly, a lot of the young people we're engaging with are in school settings, they're facing suspension, disciplinary action in school, but also crisis type responses to a young person smoking a bong at age 14 or, the current hysteria around vaping that annoys me on some level because we're all substance users. We all use to a certain extent. Some we overeat, we gamble, we do things to excess, and we're not suspended from work. We manage our addictions. The thing that annoys me when we start engaging with services is sometimes I think sometimes we need to confect a crisis to get a service response in the first place. But also we're helping young people negotiate these really punitive systems where because they're substance using, somehow they're Satan and need to be removed before they infect the rest of the school environment. And heaven forbid, if we were that proactive around COVID and other things, we may have prevented some other issues. But this hysterical response in, quite restrictive settings to, not looking at the social determinants as to what's underlying the reason for using, but focusing on the drug and demonizing the drug and the experience, I find really frustrating in this space. And Josie and Jackson, it's interesting to think about, you've got somebody that, a parent says they're in crisis, but what does drug and alcohol crisis look like compared to a mental health crisis when we're actually talking about intent to end your life or suicidal ideation? In drug and alcohol use, we often talk about death by misadventure in terms of accidental overdose. Are the two comparable, and should there be legal rights to intervene to prevent somebody from even accidentally misusing substances to the point of overdose, etc.?
Yeah.
Well, that's a big kind of statement, Malcolm, but I think that's what we try and do if we can access somebody we try and get to people as early as we possibly can, to offer them that safety information. And Jackson referred to just clean syringes and things like that if people are injecting. I think we have to be real about it. There are going to be some people in our worlds that we actually can't stop from going there in terms of that accidental overdose space. So all we can hope for is that we equip them with enough knowledge to make an informed decision. But then I guess I come back to that risk. If there's risk there, there's legislative things that you can lean into to actually break confidentiality or move into a space where you can contain the behaviour as much as you possibly can. But I come back to that. The school stuff's a real challenge for us because we're not funded enough to do early intervention and prevention work. It's the bucket of money is really, really, really targeted at that person who's hitting that crisis point or things are starting to kind of go a little bit wrong. we're always advocating to get more money in the bucket to do that prevention, education, kind of early intervention work. But I can't find that bucket for anywhere at the moment. So if anybody can find that bucket of prevention money, Jackson and I are really keen to actually work more in that, because it makes our jobs easier at that other end, because we're not seeing people as damaged, or the impact is not as big if we can work down here. We'd want to work in this stream rather than up here, but it's difficult in that funding realm. Yeah. And
that's probably where my area sits. You know, I've been looking for that bucket at the end of every rainbow. It's not up here either, by the way. It's far more punitive up here than it is in Victoria.
Yeah.
And it is that what we do know from a health outcome is for every $1 invested in prevention, it saves us $7 down the track. We know that from health economists. We're not working close enough with health economists because we don't have access to them. One of the things that's really hard, and Jackson Josie talked about evidence-based practice versus practice-based evidence. It's very difficult to get evidence-based practice on prevention because we don't know how many people we've prevented. You can't sit there and say, well, when these kids are in year 9, we did all this with them, and guess what? When they were 25, none of them were using methamphetamine. That data set's simply never going to exist in the system we've got. And when we've got a funding stream that only works on counting the negatives and not the positives, that becomes a huge, huge challenge. Gary's just sort of, you asked Gary, that is it because government are not serious about preventing people? I think government, in good faith, are interested in preventing drug use. They're just trying to do it in an economic way from their perspective, but want to also prove why they're doing it. You know, we have to have checks and balances on everything we do. Josie and Jackson, I'm going to throw you out a question. We've got 2 more areas I want to cover before we finish up. I'm now the Premier of Victoria. I think we've all been waiting for this moment for quite some time. I've finally bought a twin set and pearls and jumped into the role. And I've got a checkbook. And I'm about to open that checkbook and get you guys, and you can invite Malcolm if you like, but you know he's going to be a pain in the ass on the subcommittee. You've got a checkbook to design for Geelong, a treatment service, and we'll leave education because we know we want a big part of it to be education. We'll tick that box. A treatment service, and I suppose I look at this mental health drug treatment service going, that's huge, that's massive, because we don't treat all drugs the same way. You know, rehab's different for different things. If I was to give you 2 a magic wand and say, design what you think is going to work for our region, what would it look like?
You want to go first, Jackson?
I'm happy to.
Go.
You can take the doors, Josie.
That's it.
I think there's so many ways I could take this. I think the first one would be simply to address access would be number one. You know, I think to say that I would redesign, what's currently happening isn't fair to what's currently happening. I think there's a lot of good work that's done, and there's a really good investment. I think the Dan Andrews government invested about 318 million or something like that into AOD treatment. So there is a lot of really good services that exist and are doing a lot of fantastic work, but it's about educating the public that they exist and that they're there. How do you access them? And one of the biggest challenges regionally is people physically being able to access a service that's realistically within the area that they live in. So my dream would be to see that there is accessible face-to-face service for everyone within 15 minutes of their home. That would be my ultimate wishful thinking goal. But in terms of a new service, what I think there's a big gap missing in terms of reintegrating people back into a functioning, and I kind of put it like that because it's very personal, but into a functioning community and a functioning society. So a lot of our services are designed to bring people together who are in similar situations, in similar circumstances, and we bring them together and we kind of isolate that experience. And the same goes for one-to-one treatment. So, we get people who are, let's say they're seeing a counsellor. They come to our service and it's, an element that fits kind of over here and the rest of their life is over here. So I would like to see, and I don't know what this is, but some sort of service design that is integrated and it becomes, part of a community and part of society, rather than sitting over here, taking people out, trying to address it and then throwing them back into society. So for me, it's as simple as I think we need more services that are focused on, doing life with people and taking them on a journey of life, not just separating an AOD piece out of it. Because as I mentioned earlier, I'm a massive believer that connection's the ultimate answer to addiction. And if we can facilitate connection in a person's life, rather than asking them to come and connect with us over here, I think we're going to see much better outcomes. But again, it's not very cost effective. So that becomes the challenge.
Yeah, and that's just it. There's only finite dollars, and the government's a lot of, they've run out of, cereal, toilet paper, laundry detergent, all those things on a non-pay week. It's a tough year to budget. Josie?
Very similar to Jackson. I like to hear that because we're working alongside each other to build this. So, I mean, where we're based at 25 Gordon Avenue, I kind of think we've got golden opportunities there because we've got so much in one building, but often our intake systems and our access points shut the door. So someone, for example, can't go straight to Odyssey Barwon easily. They need to go to a centralised intake point at Barwon Health. They might pick up the phone and get a recorded message and have to leave their details there, I guess, and wait for a callback. So there's the motivation lost at that point if you can't speak to somebody. And I guess for me, access is key, place-based approaches, actually honouring the fact that someone's had the strength to walk in the door of a service and make contact with the service and not going, oh, hang on, we're not the right people for you. Here's a number to ring. So it's more about, having openness to actually just have a person sit in front of you, talk about what they really need and bring the service system together around it. And I'm more often using the term coordinated care pathways as opposed to integration at the moment, because I feel like if we use integration, it takes away the specialisation of the fields that are coming into that space. And it can have so many meanings, integration. So I think for me, I'd like to see a door that people can walk into that actually is client-centred, not funding-focused and centred and plays into the political kind of climate. It's got to be more about that. What does a person need and how do we as a service sector working collectively build it? So, integrated care models where you've got lots and lots of different services in the one building actually working together to be able to create what's needed for people. So, and I want to slow down. I think Malcolm made a comment around the slow assessment process. I think it's really important to do that and have warm referral pathways rather than someone having to connect and do an assessment in an hour and then walk away going, oh, that was my goals on that day, but they're different now. So it's that sort of taking time with people and really following them along on the journey. I'd like to see lots more sort of open community events where we sort of hold community barbecues or community kind of gatherings where people can come in and just talk to workers. So we're not seen as these weird people that are going to tell you what to do. We're real, we're human, and, it provides a bit of a non-confrontational space for people to come in and just engage a little bit and connect, to use that terminology. So my vision, place-based approaches with all that somebody might need sitting in them, and that service system coordination being the focus, us as services needing to do the work rather than the consumer who's just coming in and had the courage and brave kind of sense to step in and ask for help, not being turned away. That would probably be my kind of ideal. Yeah.
Excellent. So, again, a wealth of information from you two today, and Malcolm jumping in there too. Malcolm, have you got anything you want to add to that? I'm sure you have.
I just wanted to just quickly touch on and ask Jackson and Josie about, you know, the National Center for Drug and Alcohol in the US states addiction is a brain disease. And you hear parents get very hysterical when they discover some pot in a school bag, or I used to leave talcum powder wrapped up in foil just to give my mother a hard time, and so I could prove that she was snooping around my bedroom and tell her that she was the one that needed mental health support. But, you know, we pathologize addiction. Do you think that leads to hysteria amongst parents who are just wanting the best for their young people, yet, you know, we often forget our own experiences. We look through the lens of what's currently available. We feel that we don't have enough information. We've got synthetics, and, you know, ice is a relatively stronger version of what we used to call speed, etc. Do you think that the classification of addiction as being a disorder, a brain disorder, has led to crisis type responses, but also hysterical media type responses when, you know, I know that I'm only going to be able to use the drugs that I can find through my dealer in Geelong. If they don't have heroin or what I want or what I've sought, I will take ice because I'm looking to use.
I love this sort of conversation. There's kind of two schools of thought, right? One is the disease model, and one is more of a social model. Neither one's right nor wrong, and I think it's a personal preference. Again, it highlights how individualized substance misuse and addiction is to a person, and I think a lot of time gets caught up for people analyzing this. You know, is it an addiction, or is it a social issue? Does it matter? Like the person's in a position in life where life's not going great. They've got an addiction to a substance. Right? We know that. And so, yes, in answer to your question, Malcolm, I think, you know, that debate and that view perpetuates a lot of this fear and a lot of this, just a lot of time and resources, where really it's about what's the response needed. And, you know, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. And I think, you know, again, this is my opinion, but if it's a disease model or if it's a social model, whichever one resonates with a person and pushes them forward, then run with it. You know, if you think it's because a giraffe came to you in your dreams and gave you an addiction tablet, that's fine if it helps you towards your goals, right? The point I'm trying to make is, you know, we're very goal-oriented and we're strength-based in our approaches in AOD, and that's all forward-focused. It's all, you know, pushing forward, taking steps, getting to where you need to go. And while there's a reflection part that's needed, right, and an understanding part that's needed, it's not imperative to a person finding kind of reformation within their lives. It was really interesting. I was attending the Australian New Zealand Addiction Conference, and I was meant to be in the Gold Coast this week, and I'm not, but it's still a touchy subject, so I won't talk about it. But I got to go virtually. This professor there who was sharing some data around the first ever identified intervention for drug issues. And it was with the Indigenous Americans, so the Native Americans, and it's between 2,000 and 3,000 years old. They've dated this information that indicates that they were treating drug issues at the time. And if you know anything about that Indigenous culture, there's quite a strong emphasis on drug use in a spiritual sense. And the treatment that they used was what they called circles. And I found this fascinating. And it was about, they only treated a person and their addiction in a circle. And a circle was that community of people. So it was seen as a failure of the community rather than a failure of the person. And I think that's something that we've lost, right? Is that we now see it as a failure of a person who's in addiction, rather than reflecting back and going, you know, how did we let them down as a community? You know, did we not connect with them? Did we not support them? Was there not access or ease of access to service treatment at an earlier point? So I think, You know, for me, whether it's a disease model or a, you know, or a social issue, it's more about the response, and the response needs to be that community taking ownership. Whereas what we tend to see in the media is pointing blame and accusations and saying, this is your problem, fix it for us, not this is our problem, how can we help you fix it? And that's a big shift that needs to occur.
Yeah.
That's a great response. Hey, while I'm going to ask Josie a question, can I get everyone, now that everyone's on, to jump on and in the chat, please put their names in so we've got a record of who's attended today. Apologies, I didn't ask earlier, so I'm going to pretend I did it later so that I made sure I got those late starters. Josie, did you have anything you want to add to that?
As I was sitting there listening, I was sort of going, language can be used for good or evil. And I think sometimes the medical model gets a bit demonized itself because of the labels it can attach to people. But there is a place for that medical model. I just think it's not about actually having that as the whole focus, and respecting people's individual connection to those terms and those kind of lenses. But it's fair to say, my personal opinion, the media have used that language for evil a lot of the time. And it actually, when I hear addiction, it makes me go, oh, there's no hope. Actually, it's with the person forever and it's going to not change. And for me, as a person in the sector, I think really needs to see hope for people. So, yeah, I guess that's just what I wanted to offer there, because I think absolutely sometimes there's that chemical brain imbalance or something going on in your body that needs to be addressed to enable you to take the next step, reduce your substance use, which is the classic what come first, the chicken or egg. I think there was a comment around mental health and that sort of stuff. It's really important to treat some of the mental health symptoms with a medication at different points. So we need to honour that. But what else are we going to do? It can't just be all about meds and that medical model. So that's all I wanted to really offer in that. Yeah.
Yeah, I've always come from a service perspective of we should always have great expectations, not high expectations, not low expectations, but great expectations, because that just allows us to move in a direction. But that's any person who works in our service system should have great expectations of us as a system.
Yeah.
We should have great expectations for them, and it's really important that we continue that conversation as part of the goal setting. Now, the homework from today, if you choose to do it, and because it's a choice, is I want you to think about what you've learned, and I want you to think about that one science teacher you had at school who was probably really, really good at science, but shit at getting their point across. I had 6 years of those science teachers, and then I went to university just to prove that they do continue for some subjects. We can give you all the information in the world, and we can sit and talk to the media forever, but one of the big bits we have to get better at is key messaging. What can we take from this that in the next few months there's going to be lots in the media about this $16 million facility, and we know in the past with rehab, shooting out everything, needle exchange. Every time we put something up like this, the first thing we hear is not in my street, not in my backyard, not here, not there. I said that about the Addy when they moved next to me, not next to me, but it didn't matter. If you had to write a letter to the editor, or you were being interviewed around this $16 million facility, or you were being asked the question about methamphetamine, and we will put this question on the SCOE chat page after this session, just give me time to get that up and going, is I've put a number of articles on the SCOE chat today. They've gone up while we've been in this session around key messaging. I didn't want to take up any time talking about key messaging. I want you to have a chance, if you get a chance to read through that information that we've put up. A lot of it's come from Serena McDuff, who is incredibly good at it. And if you get a chance to watch The Drum, the woman from Newsgate was on there. She's very good at it. Is how do we do it? We know that putting a scientist on the front of a newspaper and saying, go and get a vaccine is not going to make people get a vaccine. Internally, we know it should make sense, but it just simply doesn't sell the story. How are you going to respond? how are you going to say about the importance of drug treatment? How are you going to frame that response? And there's always a time and a place for it, but I want you to start to consider the language you use. And as Josie said, language is absolutely critical. Start to think about that, because as we move forward, there's going to be a lot of to and fro around this facility in Geelong, and we're going to have to be at family barbecues. We're going to have to frontline the conversations around that. So I want you to have a go at what you've learned about methamphetamine, what you've learned about the importance of drug treatment. You've had two or three of the great minds in our region, sitting there, and Josie, Jackson and Malcolm, sitting there talking to you about this stuff. How do you now capture what they've got and put it in some key messaging? What does that look like? Start on some dot points and just work through it. But if you get a chance to read through the key messaging work I've put online, that might just help you get a sense of how you do it. And there's a fantastic, over in the US about 5 or 6 years ago, a Black Lives Matter. Sorry, it wasn't Black Lives, Black Mamas Project, sorry. The Black Mamas Project aimed to get as many African-American mothers out of prison before Mother's Day as they possibly could. And it all came down to good key messaging. We had the data sets. They'd been working on that for 10 years. Nothing shifted. As soon as they started working with key messaging expertise, they actually got a really big shift in that. So that's why it's really critical that we do a bit more work on this space. So, Cass, I'm going to throw to you. I can't see you anywhere.
I'm here.
Oh, sorry, there you are. When one person moves, everything moves on my screen.
Yeah.
I lost Jackson for a good 5 minutes at one stage. Couldn't find him anywhere. Cass, have you got anything you'd like to say before we finish up today?
Just thank you again for people to turn up. We had, the break last week, so it's good that you've all committed to returning. And I really do recommend that you jump onto the VATForce website and have a look at the SCOE chat page, because that's going to really help you imprint all of the information that you're learning today. Even if you want to talk about it in your classes, I'm sure the teachers will be happy to spend a little bit of time debriefing, or, we don't have the opportunity to speak to everybody in this environment with the 40 or 50 students. But yeah, take it back to your teachers and take that opportunity to discuss it in your groups. And not everybody put your name down in the chat box. So if anyone's not, if you just chuck your name in the chat box there, that'd be great.
Appreciate we've had a few drop off. So Malcolm, have you got anything you want to say before we finish up?
No, all good on my end. Thank you for everybody's participation. I think it's just a fabulous discussion, and I think it was just interesting to see Josie and Jackson not pass out when you talked about an open checkbook there, Lee. I thought that both might start wanting to redesign the entire CBD environment. But really fascinating discussion and great process. So thank you everyone for your participation.
Yeah, and I think we can rest at ease that I will never be made Premier for that very reason.
I was just going to say, I'm stepping out of this going, Lee Bartlett for Premier, look out.
Josie, have you got anything to say in finishing up?
I've really enjoyed the opportunity yet again, because I'm sure Jackson would attest to it, but some of the questions just really make us think about why we're here and why we do the things we do. And yeah, it's been really great to be part of. So I look forward to the next week. I was a little bit disappointed last week was cancelled, to be honest. So look forward to hanging out for another session, and good luck with your assignment piece, everyone.
And Jackson, I'm going to give you a different finish here. If you had some advice for your younger worker self, so when you first started working in the sector and you had some advice for that new worker self, what do you think it would be?
Ask more questions.
Yep.
I think it's the easiest way to learn, but it's also the most productive way to learn, I think. And I would certainly have asked more questions about everything that I could possibly ask a question about to anyone that I could ask a question about. and just not forming assumptions and judgments and opinions too early. I think I did that really early, and most of them have been smashed sideways and changed and flipped. So, you know, some of these kind of questions, as Josie said, have got us thinking, and I'm just like, geez, how would I respond to that? But I think it's, as long as you keep the fact that, you know, when we group this whole thing together of, you know, ice addicts and, you know, drug users, each of those numbers is a person, and that's the only thing that matters at the end of the day. So I certainly found it overwhelming when I started, all this stuff and all this stigma and all this, you know, bad press, but it doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, you know, it's one person, and if you ever have the opportunity to work with that one person, then, you know, that's such a great gift for us as workers to get that opportunity. So it's just bringing it always back. And Josie and I say this all the time. You know, our role is to facilitate the best outcome for each person that walks into the service, and that's the only thing that matters. The rest is interesting to talk about, but that's the only thing that matters.
Absolutely. Having great expectations and remembering that we're only in these people's lives for a fleeting second when we look at it, that we've got to, you know, continue on and being really respectful and acknowledging that, being grateful that they've come to your service. Look, again, I want to thank everybody for turning up again today. As we said, this is a test for us. It's new. We've taken a risk. I'm super excited that I've got to listen to Josie and Jackson, always learning new things. And I want to really acknowledge the fact that they don't have these questions up front, so I know I am putting them on the spot, but that's the best way to do this stuff, I think. I really do. I have put the survey in there. Please, we need that survey because sometimes evidence does help us. This is a completely unfunded piece of work for me. So if we can get some evidence that maybe this sort of approach works in the future, maybe I can write to a few people and they can say, no, we won't fund it either. But thanks for asking, because I do collect my thanks for asking. It makes me feel better about myself as a worker. Take that opportunity. If you answered 5 or less earlier, please reach out to someone around you. We know that it's a windy time, which is always good, especially if you've got kids hanging there. Go and have some lunch, and we will see you next week. Thanks again to Jackson and Josie. You guys have been awesome. Fill in your surveys, put your names down, and in the next few hours, we'll have that SCOE chat up and running for you. So take care, everyone.